Welcome in everyone to a very special episode of American Joyride. I'm joined today by Sam Goodwin. He's the author of, as you can see right here, Saving Sam. It is the incredible story of his time in Syria, how he got out of Syria, as well as world travels. Sam, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, David. It's my pleasure. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, and like I was saying before we started recording, this is a very nice change of pace for me because I know a lot of people who've been to Syria, but they went with the United States Army doing combat operations against ISIS or whatever it might be. And you're coming at it from, you were just there as a tourist. You were traveling the world. You had the goal of visiting every country in the world, which I believe you accomplished. Your last one was Brazil, right?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a little bit different angle, and I'm excited to have the chance to talk about it with you today. But um, yeah, you're exactly right. I from 2010 to 2020, in those 10 years, much of which I spent living and working overseas, I traveled to every country in the world.
And that's absolutely incredible. And where your story kind of gains national attention is when you decide to take a trip to Syria. Now, people might hear this and they would say, that's crazy. Syria's been in a civil war since 2010, 2011. It's a terribly dangerous place. This is the perception, right? What motivated you to want to go to a country like Syria?
Yep. So one of the most significant things that I learned through my travels is that places that are negatively perceived or that Western media tells us we're not supposed to like, these were the same places where I had many of my best experiences. At the same time, safety was always the top priority on my travels. I don't think it's cool to be in unsafe situations. I don't go looking for trouble. But for example, I've camped at the base of Angel Falls in Venezuela. I went to the Olympics in in Sochi in Russia. I coached North Korea's national hockey team, which maybe we can talk about. I celebrated New Year's Eve on Kish Island in Iran. I went to a Formula E race in Saudi Arabia, and truly some of these experiences were the best I ever had. And despite all the instability that was happening in Syria, I was confident that the same was going to be the case. And it turned out to not be the case. But Syria was country 181 of 193, and nothing like what happened there had happened to me anywhere else. And the situation became pretty uncomfortable.
And that's exactly what we're going to dive into. Can you explain for the audience the logistics of how an American is able to get into a country like Syria?
So the logistics were a big part of my journey around like visas and entry permission, especially like visas in Africa and places that don't have diplomatic ties with the US. Sometimes that can be challenging and can be long bureaucratic processes. And I had this big spreadsheet that I used to keep track of all the entry logistics and how I was doing all of that. So it can be a little bit more involved of a process sometimes, depending on what the relationship is and what the entry requirements are.
So but specifically for a country like Syria, which I don't believe, now feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Syria is like advertising for Americans to come visit for tourist reasons. So did you have to cross the border from where? Lebanon, Turkey? How'd you get into the country?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, many of the countries that I went to don't have diplomatic ties with the US, and Syria is one of those. So I traveled to Syria by land from Iraq, and there are other ways to do it, but I went from Iraq by land into Syria that way.
And do they check you right at the border and you have, a travel visa and they just wave you through? Or because you're an American, you're a white dude, they start grilling you with questions? Are they automatically suspicious?
There were plenty of questions, but I had the entry permission before I entered, and I went to the Iraq side of the border, and I went into an office, and they looked at my passport and put information into a computer, and then I went across the river and went into another office on the Syrian side. An immigration official looked at my passport, put information into a computer, and that was how I went into Syria.
In what part of, do you remember specifically what part of Syria you crossed over in?
So this was at Faish Kabor in the northeast, and the northeast part of Syria is controlled by the Kurds, which have a relatively strong relationship with the U.S., especially in the fight against ISIS. So that was the way that I went with the um, credentials from the Kurds who were controlling that area.
And before all hell breaks loose and we get into the nightmare scenario that you unfold, what did you want to do in Syria? What was the goals of the trip?
So my plan was to stay for a few days. I was going to see some of the things to see in that area in Kamishli. I'm a lifelong Catholic, and my faith was a big part of my travel journey. So I planned to attend Mass on Sunday morning in the Kamishli area, and of course, my plans changed. But those were my general plans to stay for a few days and experience what I thought I could experience in a safe way.
And now let's get to the big reason, the book, Saving Sam, why you are here. You eventually get taken into custody or kidnapped, arrested, whatever you want to call it, by the government of Syria, Syrian agents. Walk us through starting that day. I'm sure you get up, day like every other day. Walk the audience through how that event started to unfold.
So it was just 2 hours after I had arrived, and I was walking through a roundabout on the way to meet up with my guide when all of a sudden this black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. Two armed men jumped out of the back seat and instructed me to get inside. And thankfully, they weren't violent, but I didn't have a choice. I was scared, confused. I had no information or anyone to help. It was desperately trying to understand what was happening. And it turns out that these men were loyal to the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, and told me that they were skeptical about my travel history and my travel motives. And as we sped down back alleys of the city, the officers in the vehicle, they accused me of espionage, of being an American spy and collaborating with terrorists. And as I mentioned, nothing like this had ever happened to me before.
And at that point, are you trying to explain to them, I have proper paperwork, I'm allowed to be here? Are they interested in anything you have to say?
I was trying to explain to them that I am a traveler. I'm here to experience the country. I literally at one point told them, look at my Instagram, but all of this essentially fell on deaf ears. And it seemed as if they were going to ship me to Damascus and accuse me of these things, regardless of what I said.
And so let's take it step by step here. So these two guys got you. They're whipping down back roads. They're clearly they don't trust the word that's coming out of your mouth. At what point do you realize this is actually about to get extremely serious?
We pulled over on the side of the road, and the officer in the vehicle sitting next to me, he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a blindfold and put it over my eyes. And at that point, I realized that things were not going in a good direction. And the truck drove for about 5 minutes and then it stopped. And I stepped out of the vehicle and they took the blindfold off. And I remember I looked up and I was underneath a massive Syrian military airplane out on the tarmac of an airport. And they handcuffed me behind my back, took me over to the ladder, and threw me into the cargo hold of this plane. And about 30 minutes later, the plane took off. And sometimes what I find myself asking people when I tell this story is, how often have you been flying on an airplane and not known where the plane is going? And that was the
Zero.
situation I found myself in. This overwhelming cloud of uncertainty was growing all around me.
I do want to back up just a tiny bit here. When these two Syrian agents that you say are loyal to Assad, when they first grabbed you, did you think that maybe they were ISIS or some other faction? Because for the audience who doesn't know, Syria is obviously not, there's different areas under different control of different people, right? So was there any fear that this might be ISIS fighters?
One of the biggest challenges I had was the language barrier because they weren't speaking English and they weren't able to, and they weren't willing to. And so I was very confused about who they were. I wasn't able to identify who they were. And it is a little bit unusual at that point to have Assad's troops in that part of the country, but I wasn't sure who it was. And frankly, for most of this initial period, I was just thinking that this was a big mistake. And I was thought, I don't know who these people are. I don't know what they want. I don't know what's going on, but this is a mistake and it's going to get figured out. And it didn't get figured out in the way that I thought it was going to.
Absolutely. So back to the plane. So you're flying. You have no idea where you're going at this point. You're in the cargo hold of this military aircraft. Can you hear people talking around you, or are you just completely isolated?
I was put in this little nook in the plane, and there were a few people around. There was a guy kind of watching me a little bit, but that's all that I could really see. And I was trying to remain kind of positive, trying to maintain some kind of emotional stability, but I realized that things were not seemingly going in a very good direction, and I was becoming pretty scared.
And how long was this plane from where you were to wherever it ultimately ends up landing?
The plane flew for about 90 minutes, and we landed in what I learned to be Damascus, the Syrian capital city. And when we landed, I was taken from there, driven into the center of town, and taken into the basement of a facility that I now know is called Syria's military intelligence prison number 215, a facility notoriously known for housing political prisoners. And I'll never forget the officer in charge. He spoke a little bit of English, and he escorted me to a cell in the back of the basement. And when he put me in there, he went to the inside of the cell door and he said, food, water, toilet, knock. Otherwise, quiet, no talking. And he slammed the door and left.
That is terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Was the demeanor of the guards or that guy, the people that are in this prison handling you, what was their demeanor? Because now they've got their hands on an American who they think, I believe we're going to explain, they think you're an American intelligence asset. How was their body language? How were they behaving?
I was stunned and in disbelief about what had happened in just a few short hours. My life had spiraled out of control in the most terrifying of ways. And to answer your question, they made me feel exactly the way they wanted me to feel. Hopeless, utterly cut off from any control of my life.
I'm in a state of shock listening to how this goes. So at this point, they've got you in the prison. Now, I believe you eventually moved to a secondary prison, but while you're in this one, how long do they leave you before someone knocks on the door again and explains to you this is what's happening?
Yeah, thankfully the cell wasn't too small. I could walk around just a little bit, but it had no window. It was all concrete. I had nothing but a small blanket to lay on the concrete floor as a bed. And I remained here in solitary confinement for 27 days. And to answer your question, the only human interaction I had for the most part was just a few seconds in the morning and evening when the guards brought bread and boiled potatoes and water.
And I gotta ask because I'm curious, what does boiled potatoes and bread in a Syrian prison taste like?
It's a pretty simple, low calorie, basic diet, just kind of enough to exist. And occasionally I got a tomato, but that was pretty much everything that I had, and it was a very basic calorie intake.
And have they accused you yet at this point in time of being a spy, or are you still completely in the dark while you're sitting in solitary confinement?
I, Perhaps the biggest challenge that I faced in that situation was the overall uncertainty, the lack of information. Based on, I sometimes say to people that if I told you, like David, if I told you you're going to go and sit in a dungeon on the other side of the world, you're going to be fed bread, boiled potatoes, and water. You're going to hear other people around you being tortured, but you're not going to be physically harmed, although solitary confinement is its own torture. And on day 27, you're going to be let out. Now, I'm not saying that you'd be comfortable, but what I am saying is that you'd be in a completely different situation knowing that finish line,
Right.
knowing on day 27. And the biggest challenge that I had was the uncertainty of the situation. So, based on the information I had, I believed all of these potential outcomes were possible. So, was I going to be released in a week? Based on the information I had, I thought that was possible. Was I going to be released in 5 minutes? I thought that was possible. Was I going to be in that cell forever? Were they going to torture me or stop feeding me or just open the door and shoot me? Based on the information I had, I believed that all of these potential outcomes were possible, and trying to entertain them 24/7 was emotionally and psychologically exhausting.
I, I'm sure it is. I can't even imagine because you're just constantly running through your head. Is today the day they, like you said, they open the door and shoot me? Do I
Or I
starve
get
to death,
released.
or I get released? Do you think the fact that you were an American was the reason they did not torture you?
I think that's possible, and I've debriefed with quite a few intel folks in here in the U.S. since I came home, and I think that's possible. I in the second month, which maybe we'll talk about, when I was moved to the other prison, I had a couple of the inmates say that the Syrian authorities wouldn't torture me because they're terrified of what the U.S. military is capable of, which I found to be some interesting insight. So I think it was potentially my passport that saved me from physical torture, but I don't know for sure.
I would have to, and I'm just making an educated guess. I would have to imagine it is because logically, their two choices are they have to kill you or they eventually have to release you. And if they release you and you tell everyone these people tortured me brutally, that's going
They're
to
in
be
trouble.
they're in huge trouble.
You're
So
exactly right. Yeah.
you got to be, I mean, rationally, I understand the thinking of that. So let's talk about, I believe I read that you did multiple court appearances with no translator of any kind and no legal help of any kind. Is that how it unfolded?
This happened in the second month.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
let's go to this. Let's go to the second month then. Have they moved you now out of the prison free court dates, or do you go to court and then they move you to a different prison?
So on day 27, I was taken out of solitary confinement. I was driven across town to the outskirts of the city and taken to a facility called Adra, which I learned is one of the country's central federal prisons, more like a general population situation. And I was put in a cell with about 40 other men. And I remained here for the next 35 days, for another month. And during this time, I was put on trial in Damascus. I went to court 4 times, and in all 4 sessions, the judge denied me a lawyer, denied me a translator, continued to characterize me as a threat to their security, and was unwilling to share any information about what might happen to me. The whole process seemed to be taking place inside this like ideological vacuum, and it wasn't going to be impacted by anything I said or did, and it seemed as though I was dealing with some of the most thoughtless and least sophisticated people I'd ever met, and they held the keys, like literally and figuratively, to the rest of my life, is how it felt. I've learned in the wake of this that the trial was very much just for show and a sham, and that judge had no authority in the entire situation, was allegedly being handled at a much higher national security level, but it wasn't any less frustrating for me at the time based on the information that I had.
And what you said there's just key based on the information you have. You don't know that this judge isn't running the show. You might
Exactly.
you believe he is, and you believe that he's screwing with the rest
It
of
was
your
actually a
life.
she. It was a female judge,
Oh,
and I didn't, right, based on what I had, I thought she was the decision maker, and it became really frustrating when she kept telling me, "Come back in a week, come back in 10 days," and I couldn't do anything because I had no communication or anything.
and that's what I. So this is where the really fascinating to me because you have no idea what's going back on in the United States. How quickly did your family learn that you were not where you were supposed to be?
The news of my disappearance was essentially learned through me going dark. And I had communicated that I was going to be in Syria, as I mentioned, for just a few days. And when that time passed and they weren't hearing from me, that's when they began to worry. So it was just a couple of days in.
And I want to pivot it's kind of weird because there's two sides
Okay.
to this stories. And
Hmm.
so can you give us a timeline? You're in prison, you've been kidnapped, arrested, whatever we're going to call it. Now, a few days in, your family's been alerted. Can you walk us through the timeline of what they're doing that you don't even know about, but you find out later?
Yep. So when I was released, which I can talk about, and I was reunited with my parents, I'll never forget. A couple minutes later, I I was thinking about everything that had happened in the past 9 weeks, and I said to my parents, it was looking back kind of a naive comment, but I said to them, like, I have a story for you. And that I'll never forget, the two of them looked at each other and then looked back at me, and my mom said, well, Sam, we have a story for you too. And I was confused because when I was trapped on the inside, I had no idea about anything that was happening on the outside. And it's been overwhelming to learn about all of the people who worked on my behalf, from people who loved me to people who had no idea who I was, and everywhere in between. And so the story is that, as I mentioned, they learned of my disappearance by me going dark. And my father works in civil engineering. My mother's a registered nurse turned educator. Both of them are smart people and have had relative success in their respective fields, but they're an average family from middle America. They had no idea what to do when their son went missing in the Middle East, but thankfully they began to act, and they reached the FBI field office in St. Louis, which pretty quickly escalated some of the highest levels of the US government in Washington. But throughout my captivity, my family had kind of a roller coaster experience with the US government. But early on, the government communicated two key things to my family. The first, they said, we strongly recommend that you keep this out of the news, keep all of the communication very tight. They said that don't let the press get a hold of this, because if they do, and Sam's captors, depending on who they are, which was still unknown at the time, feel that type of pressure, they might just kill him. The second thing they said was, they said you should really manage your expectations. We have no diplomatic or economic ties with Syria. There may not be a whole lot we can do here to help. So then, about 3 weeks later, my younger sister, Stephanie, who was 25 years old at the time, living in Nashville, she particularly became entirely overwhelmed with everything that was happening. And she decided that she needed to call someone and talk to them about this and just blow off some steam, which was against the recommendation of the US government of keeping all of the communication very tight. So she decided that she was going to call her former college roommate, who is coincidentally also named Stephanie. So there's this phone call between the Stephanies, and as the story goes, it's hey, how you doing? And my Steph says, well, actually, things aren't very good. And she goes on to explain, my brother's been missing for weeks. Nobody's heard from him. We're working with all of these agencies and officials. Nobody's been able to help. We're really scared. And roommate Steph was, of course, shocked to hear something like this, but she says all the right things, offers her full support. And at the end of the call, as the story goes, roommate Steph says, hey, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. And my Steph responds almost jokingly or sarcastically. She says, well, unless you know someone who knows Assad, the Syrian president, uh, please just pray. And roommate Steph, kind of this light bulb goes off, and she goes, wait, let me call you back. And it turns out that roommate Steph is Lebanese, and her uncle is good friends with a man named General Abbas Ibrahim, who heads Lebanon's internal security, kind of like the equivalent of the FBI or the CIA here in the US. And General Ibrahim was able to mediate my release with his counterparts in Damascus. So this became the situation where the the FBI, the CIA, the White House, Pentagon, Pope Francis was involved, Russian intelligence, Middle East NGOs, private sector security companies. They were all, in a lot of ways, struggling to be effective. But my sister's college roommate could identify a path to get an American hostage released from captivity in the Middle East. And that was how this resolved.
I have so many questions to unpack. I mean, this is like a Tom Clancy movie. So I want to go back to what you said, where the government told you to manage your expectations, or told your family, excuse me, to manage their expectations. That to me, and I maybe a lot of viewers listening to this, why couldn't the U.S. government, through either a middleman or outright say, let them go? Like, we're stronger than you, we're bigger than you. You can either let them go or there's going to be serious consequences. Like, why, to me, like, why was that not an option?
So a couple of things that I would say on that. One is this all happened with my family, so they would have the firsthand account on these discussions. But from what I understand, the first thing I'll say is, first of all, I don't know for sure that that didn't happen. So what we believe is the case is that it was the Lebanese. Now, there may have been some things happening behind the scenes a little bit, but we're pretty sure that it was the Lebanese. The second is that the apparently just the lack of diplomatic ties, the lack of communication meant that the White House wasn't just going to pick up the phone and call the Syrians and say, do this, because that communication doesn't exist. So those were, the main, I think that was the main reason why the government was struggling to be effective. And in fact, this is mentioned in the book. At one point, the FBI, who my family was working with, they told my family that you are going to have to find an influencer of President Assad, someone who can plead his case. And my parents and I looked at each other and were like, you're telling us that we have to find someone who's going to do this? And my mom's like, Osama, Bashar, who are like Saddam. These are all just bad men on the other side of the world. To me, I don't even know who these people are, right? So that became a dramatic moment when the government told my family that they were going to have to figure this out because of that lack of diplomatic ties.
That to me is frankly unacceptable for the government to have made a comment like you said. Your parents, very smart people, hardworking people, great parents. They're not foreign. They're not the Secretary of State. That's not what they do for a
I
living.
mean,
That's ridiculous.
my mom has a doctorate in education. Like, she's a relatively smart person. I mean, but she admits she couldn't even name her two senators from Missouri. And it's just a totally different space. They're not, and I think like a lot of Americans, they're not focused on foreign policy. They're not in that space. And so it became this overwhelming task.
So when I was researching this for this interview, I read an article that claimed that some people from Russian, they had said that the Syrians definitely didn't have you. And then someone else came back and said, yes, they absolutely do have you. So at what point is confirmation, to your knowledge, 100% confirmed that yes, he is in the custody of the Assad regime?
I would say that that confirmation came when General Abbas Ibrahim went to Damascus and met with his counterpart, whose name is General Ali Mamluk. And the information came back that the Syrians were holding me. And then that came back to my family in a relatively, what seemed to be a relatively credible way. And at that point, my family had felt like they had pretty good information about where I was being held and who was holding me.
And I know that there's a picture of it in the book. You always order the salmon at the country club, which it sounds like it's code, but it's not. It was just used to identify who you were. Could you walk us through that note and what the purpose of all that was and why that existed?
Yeah, so about 2 weeks into the second month, one of the other inmates who I had become kind of friends with, and he spoke English pretty well, he came to me and told me that he could get a note out of the prison on my behalf. And of course, he had my attention very quickly. I was starving for communication at this point, and he told me that the next day was was visitor day, and he had a friend coming who was going to bring clean laundry. And this guy, my fellow inmate, was going to give him dirty laundry to swap it out. And he told me that he could hide this note in his dirty laundry if I wanted to write something. So I only had like 30 seconds to write this because of the way we were being moved around. And so I took a pen and a piece of paper and I wrote my dad's name and his phone number. I wrote where I was, and then I gave it to my new friend, and he said, Sam, hang on, you should put a clue on the note so that if it makes it to your dad, like he knows for sure that it came from you. And I remember thinking like, gosh, that's a great idea. I've never done this before, but that makes a lot of sense. So I scribbled that I always order the salmon at the Missouri Athletic Club, which is just a recreational facility that my family's gone to for years in St. Louis. And I sent that out to him, and I never heard anything back about the note. But when I was released, my parents said, "Hey, we received the note." And so it turns out that this note had navigated this game of geopolitical telephone and made it to my parents in St. Louis. And they say that when they read the note, and particularly that clue, they knew for sure that they went to the FBI, who was basically on speed dial at that point, and said, we have this note, and we're 100% sure that it came from Sam because of that clue that was on there. And so I'm very grateful to my fellow inmate for taking that risk to help me communicate. And that became one of the brighter moments for my family as they were trying to piece this together, thanks to really the kindness and support of a complete stranger.
And like I said, for those of you who get the book Saving Sam, there is a photo of that specific note in the book. It's very, very cool to see. If he had been caught, if that inmate had been caught slipping that note out, what do you think would have happened? What would the consequences for something like that be in a Syrian prison?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know for sure, but we were being held at that point in kind of a general population, just by no means a comfortable place, but a significant upgrade from the first month in solitary confinement, no doubt. And my guess would be that if he would have been caught, he would have been sent, backwards to somewhere that's not nearly as comfortable.
Did you at any point in time think to yourself or maybe hold out hope that there might be some kind of rescue operation that gets launched?
I especially in the first month, I passed time by doing lots of things, and one of those things was to just dream up these crazy things that I thought might happen, ways that I might get out. And so I envisioned the cell door swinging open and the SEALs coming in and showing me an American flag on their sleeve or something like that. I was thinking about the names of like my first pet and my teachers in grade school, because I've heard or seen in movies where they have a question that they ask to basically verify that they have the right person. And I mean, I imagine a tunnel being carved into the cell and Gal Gadot coming in. I mean, it just anything that could pass time. So, but I did. I mean, my godfather was in the Navy, and so I imagined, him bringing a ship into the Mediterranean and them coming in by chopper and taking me out. Truly, just anything. In solitary confinement, there's a lot of time, so start to think about all of these things that could happen. And I did dream up these crazy scenarios partly to maintain hope, and on the other hand, partly um, to just pass time.
And the reason I ask that is because, as the viewers of this show know, at this point in time, when you've been taken in Syria, there are military assets all over Syria of the United States of America. And to me, one of the first option I would think, and maybe not, is, hey, do we have guys close enough to where we can just fly in the middle of the night, grab them, and leave? Because they conduct missions like that all the time over there. So that's frustrating for me, is just the guy who's learning your story, to be, was that, I want to know, was that ever considered? Was it planned?
So I think that if the case would have gone on longer, I think the chance of that would have potentially become more likely. But I don't know for sure. But I think if it would have gone on longer, then that could have happened.
So I want to get into the part now where it's literally like out of a Tom Clancy film, when you finally get, well, real quick, the phone. So there was a phone in the jail, right? But you could only use Arabic and you could only call within Syria, which made that phone kind of absolutely useless to you, right? So how did that, but you kind of got creative. So can you walk the audience through the phone that you were allowed to use?
Yeah. So after I sent the letter out and didn't hear anything back, I was trying other ways to communicate. And what I realized was that there was this phone that was passed around amongst the cells, and inmates could make phone calls occasionally. But I learned there were two rules with the call. Any conversation on the phone had to be in Arabic, and all calls had to be made within Syria. So it became kind of useless to me, or I thought it seemed that way. But I thought about it a little bit more, and I ended up approaching another inmate of mine who became a friend. And I do want to mention these other inmates in a second because they're truly incredible people. But uh, I asked him if he could just call someone and then have that person communicate to someone else. Like this should work, right? So long story short, put this plan together where he called his turned out to be his sister who was in Damascus, and then his sister sent my sister a message on Instagram. And it turned out to be my sister Stephanie, so the same sister who had actually connected with her college roommate. But one of the challenges that I had was I needed to give this guy the exact Instagram handle of my of who I wanted her to send a message to. And how many Instagram handles can you actually remember, like, exactly? There aren't that many, right? We just go to them. So I was going down the list of like my family members trying to think, and it got to my sister Stephanie, and I knew exactly what it was. So I gave that information, and he called his sister, and then his sister messaged Stephanie, and Stephanie tells the story of receiving this random Instagram message saying that her brother was in prison with with Steph's brother. So it became another line of communication that I managed to establish. And my family tells the story that the FBI was kind of blown away by this, that there was communication coming from me in that situation, but managed to communicate in another way there and establish just a little bit of communication, thanks to the help again of these strangers.
Did you ever, once you eventually get out, did you ever find out what happened to the guys that you were in with?
So today, over the past few years, several of them have also been released, and I'm now in touch with all of them. We exchanged information. We're in touch. Some of them are still in Syria. Some of them have fled to Lebanon and Turkey, or into Europe, and they're truly these incredible people. I'll never forget. I'm about 2 weeks into that second month, about the same time that the letter was being sent out. I said to a guy I had met, I said, hey, everybody here is being so nice to me. It was kind of hard to know what to expect in a situation like this. And I'll never forget, he said, Sam, in Syria, all the good people are here in prison because all the bad people are outside putting us in here. And it was a very sobering comment to hear from a geopolitical standpoint and everything that's happening. And one of the challenges I'll mention, one of the challenges that I think I have with my story is just the way that I portray the country of Syria, because this is a place that is one of the most culturally, religiously, historically significant places in the world. It's heartbreaking what's happened over the past now 13 years since the 14 years since the Arab Spring. And yes, there is an authoritarian regime that's causing all kinds of trouble, but underneath that, there are people just like us. And one of the most important things I learned through my travels is that the overwhelming majority of people are well-intentioned, proud of their country, happy to help others. And that was what I found everywhere in the world, including in a Syrian prison with these other inmates who are now friends of mine today.
I love the fact you made that point because it actually echoes and mirrors what a lot of the military dudes I interview say exactly the same. You know, they're out killing ISIS fighters, but the point they always make is like a lot of these people, just not ISIS fighters, but people that were under ISIS control or whatever it might be, they just wanted to live their lives. They want to take care of their kids and their family just like everyone else. And they just unfortunately got caught up in a situation where bad people got involved and now they're in a war that they never asked for, never wanted. That's very interesting that you on the civilian side have made essentially the same point that the military side would make. On that note of viewing the Syrian people, and then I want to get into how you know your eventual release.
Yeah.
Do you hold any ill will towards the Assad regime? Do you hold like anger towards what just the apparatus that allowed this to unfold, the show trials, the regime. How do you feel about all that stuff?
This was a really uncomfortable time for myself, for my family. It was a significant challenge, and I wouldn't want to relive captivity. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. One of the things that I focused very hard on and prayed a lot for while I was in captivity and still today is the I view the world through a spiritual lens, and I prayed very hard for the courage to forgive my captors. And through that, I discovered that I was working to forgive people who weren't even sorry. And that's strength. Forgiveness is not a feeling, it's a choice. On one hand, I would never want to relive captivity. On the other hand, having reflected on this and now speaking about it for a living, I I would also never want to give up everything that's come from it. The opportunity to meet some remarkable people, to grow in character and in faith, and really an understanding of the stuff in life that actually matters. And those two things go together, and that perspective is so important. And while Syria doesn't define me, it has become a part of who I am. And I expect the lessons that I learned, that my family learned through this experience to stick with me in some shape or form for the rest of my life.
Well said. Why do you think, Assad, the dictator of Syria, who had been fighting a brutally bloody civil war for years and years, and then ISIS comes in, not a good guy by any stretch of the imagination, ruthless dictator. He could have called up the jail at any point in time and said, let this guy go, not worth the trouble. I don't want to deal with this. He obviously did not. When do you, if you had to speculate, two questions. When do you think Assad became aware that an American was being held by his people? Because he obviously had to know eventually. And two, what do you think the Assad regime's reason for keeping you was? What were they looking for?
Yeah, I don't know the answers to those questions, but I do think that when General Ibrahim intervened from Lebanon, I think that's when the Syrians started to realize that I was who I was saying I was. I was not a threat to their national security. I was not a spy. I was truly just someone exploring and better understanding the world. That's what I was truly doing. And I think they started to figure that out once the Lebanese began to intervene. And I think that Assad knew about this in the first few weeks. I think at some point in those first couple weeks, the information got to him, and he said, well, let me think about what to do with him. I think they were trying to figure out who I actually was, but I think he did know, and he also I have pretty good information that suggests that he did personally sign off on releasing me.
Well, that is fascinating that you'll be able to say forever that one of the most famous, infamous dictators in the world signed for yours. And now let's talk about that. So walk me through. You don't have any idea what's going on with the general in Lebanon. You don't have any idea what's going on stateside. The moment you get released, I cannot wait to hear about this. Walk me through step by step how you end up getting out.
Yep. So on July 26th, one of the inmates came to the cell I was in. He called my name and he indicated that I was being moved. And as he escorted me outside, kind of going back to my last point here, he said, Sam, you're very lucky. He said, President Assad has agreed to release you. Now, this sounds encouraging, but I had been lied to so many times in the past 2 months by the officials, by the judge, that I had essentially become immune to believing anything like this. But outside, I stepped into a black SUV, which turned out to be part of this 5 vehicle convoy that raced out of Damascus at what seemed to be 100 miles an hour. I mean, we didn't stop at traffic lights. We used the shoulder of the road to maneuver around traffic. We drove west towards the mountains, and nobody in the vehicle said a word. The the nice cars, the professional nature of the operation was making me think that this was all really good or really bad. I'm about to experience one extreme of the captivity spectrum here, but I don't know
Let me
which
ask
one
you,
it is.
when you see these guys in the car, are they wearing like suits and ties? Are they in military gear?
They were in military gear, and I learned later that they were Lebanese special forces, but I
So did
wasn't sure about that at the time.
so did they have guns on them in the vehicle?
Uh, in the other vehicles, they did. The guy in my vehicle, he was in military uniform. He was not carrying a gun, but the others in the vehicles behind us and in front of us, they were.
And is the reason for the convoy just to make sure that a terrorist group or whatever doesn't hit the convoy on its way back to Lebanon?
I think that's right. And my understanding is that this was an operation or a mission, so to speak. It was all peaceful, thankfully, but they had their agenda for that day was to come into Damascus, get me, and escort me to Beirut. And if something were to get hairy or to go sideways, they were prepared for that. That's what it seemed like to me.
That I am so incredibly fascinated by every step of this. So you're racing in these vehicles, you're riding the road to the shoulder. It is literally like a scene out of a movie. I can hear like the dramatic music in the background. When you cross the border, now you're into Lebanon. What happens once you cross that threshold?
So we came up to this checkpoint, and it seemed to be some kind of significant border. And as we passed through, the officer in the vehicle sitting next to me, he subtly tapped me on the leg, and he said, Sam, you're in Lebanon. You're safe now. This was this was also very encouraging, but I had been lied to again. I've been lied to so many times. I was still trying to figure out what was going on, and we drove from there for about another hour into Beirut, the capital city of Lebanon, and I was taken to the office of Lebanese internal security, kind of like, as I mentioned, the equivalent of an intelligence agency here in the U.S. And when I walked into the office, in addition to dozens of government and military intelligence officials and journalists, my parents were there, culminating this moment that was indescribably emotional, one that many people thought would never happen, and frankly, this breathtaking display of God answering prayers.
And at this point, are there any American diplomats in Lebanon with you? You say government officials. Are these Lebanese government officials or are Americans there as well?
The FBI attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon. His name was Anish Shukla. He was there, and he was actually the first person who welcomed me there. I'll never forget. He said, "Sam, there are so many people back in Washington who are very happy that you're safe." And I remember thinking, how does anybody in Washington even know who I am? I don't even know how that's possible. And then I started to put the pieces together from there. But I had never even talked to a real FBI person before in my life. And so it was overwhelming to start to put those pieces together.
How quickly after this meeting in Beirut happens are you out of the country and back in the United States?
We had my parents had just arrived that morning, and so we had the option to leave immediately. We ended up just staying for one evening in Beirut and then leaving the next day and flying back.
Do you remember the first thing, your first real meal that you had after getting out of Syrian prison?
So I had some Lebanese food that night with my parents, and then came home the next day, and my first meal was a Chipotle burrito because I was missing that. But actually, um, on that note, a couple days later, about 3 days later, I ended up in the emergency room. I was back in St. Louis. I went to the ER because of stomach pain, and when I came home, I went a little bit crazy with the food, like double cheeseburgers and Chipotle and all these things, ice cream. And it turns out that in those 2 months, my stomach had essentially adapted to this very simple, basic, low calorie diet and was kind of struggling to process a normal Western diet. And I went to the hospital, and thankfully it was pretty simple to sort out. But it does make me wonder about the reintegration process for others who are held for sometimes much longer, sometimes years, and what that process would look like for them. Because even for me, after 9 weeks, I was experiencing that.
Did you have to explain to the doctors that you'd been held in prison in Syria for 2 months, and did they
You know
believe
what?
you?
I don't get to tell this story very much. So I'm glad you asked because I went to the doctor and the nurse. I was with my mom, and the nurse was doing her kind of like before the doctor comes in, she was doing her checklist. She was asking questions, and she was trying to figure out like how this could have happened. And I said, "Yeah, I just came home. I was taken hostage in Syria." And I will never forget, she was poker face, just stone faced, and wrote this down and just made a note of it. And then she left, and I looked at my mom, and I was like, wow, there was no reaction at all, which, and then I looked at it, we saw it in the notes, and it was just interesting that there was like no reaction. So,
I definitely would have had a reaction. When you get back to the US, did anyone from the US government try to debrief you or question you on anything that had happened when you were in control of the Syrian regime?
yeah, so they got in touch pretty quickly. And as soon as they kind of verified that I was relatively healthy and kind of with my family, they wanted to talk to me if I was willing. And they told me that the information that I had could potentially help them with other cases. And this is when I began learning about Austin Tice and Maj Kamalmaz and these others who've been missing. And so I was very willing to do whatever I could. If there was something I had that might be able to help another person who was in that situation or something worse, I was more than willing to do anything I could immediately. So they actually came to St. Louis I bet this was within the first week that I was home. And I sat with a couple FBI agents for an entire day and tried to, I just tried to share everything I could, any details about, Assad's Gulag archipelago that I could imagine and remember that may be helpful. So they they continue to tell me that it was helpful. Who knows because Austin's still missing, but I tried to share what I could in an attempt to try to help the next person.
Well, I am so glad you brought up Austin Tice. That was literally the question leading into a question about Austin Tice, For the audience who doesn't know, I believe Austin Tice went missing in what, about 2011, 2012, right around
2012,
there.
yeah. Yeah.
And didn't they originally believe he might have been kidnapped by ISIS and then handed over to the Assad regime? Isn't that kind of what they think? But they know they know Assad has him.
Yeah, the public information on his case is a little bit thin. I haven't heard much about him in a few years now, actually. Mark and Deborah, his parents, are friends of mine. It's heartbreaking what they've endured for so long now. But there was, as you mentioned, there was a video that came out not too long after he went missing that seemed to indicate that he was being held by rebels or terrorists. And then later, I believe some intelligence folks kind of said that the video was sort of staged and not really real. And so it became very complicated. There's some information that suggests that Austin was actually held in Branch 215 for a little bit, the same place that I was in. But I don't know about any of these things. It's all pretty thin information, but I'm just heartbroken for the family, and it's unimaginable what they've been through. But in the wake of my experience, I learned a lot about him, and have tried to do anything I can to help. It hasn't been much, I don't think, but I've always tried to.
Well, I know the last major update with Austin Tyson. I know that we all want him and everyone else who's an American held, unjustly around the world to come home. Was they have reportedly got close, I think, in 2019 or 2020, right at the tail end of the Trump administration, to negotiating a deal, and it fell through. If you believe the reports, at the 11th hour, which means he is alive, which means that they do have him, which means it's still possible you can get him back. But as an American, it's very frustrating that any American citizen is held certainly when they didn't do anything wrong, and they just won't give them back. And on that note, I'll close out the Syria part of this interview, which has been absolutely outstanding. Would you ever go back to Syria? And if Assad wanted to meet with you, like he somehow reaches out and says, I want to sit down face to face and talk to you about what happened, would you go back and meet with him?
So to your first question, I have kind of a complicated relationship with Syria, but at the same time, the whole reason that I traveled, the whole reason that I had this journey was to learn and better understand the world and its people. And I feel like I wasn't, in some ways, I feel like I learned more about Syria than I ever would. On the other hand, I was never free there. I never got to experience what I wanted to. So if the situation arose, I would actually love that opportunity to do that. As I mentioned, it's one of the most significant, culturally, religiously significant places in the world. It's the cradle of civilization. It's mentioned more than 300 times in the Bible. So I would love that opportunity. It's just a little bit challenging. Now, one of the other inmates who I was with in Adra, he recently invited me to his wedding in Damascus. And, unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to, I don't think I'm going to make it just because of the situation. But yes, I would love that opportunity when the situation is different. The second question, yeah, I would love to sit down and ask some questions. I'd have a lot of questions, but I would be happy to have that opportunity and really try to, I mean, not just question. I mean, I'd have some questions about me specifically, but I'd have some bigger geopolitical, kind of historical, just general decision-making questions that I would really like to ask.
Well, that's fascinating. What would be the biggest one of those questions that you would want to ask him?
It'd be like, do you think you've done anything wrong over the past 14 years?
Yeah.
Like, how do you just what just explain it to me. Explain it. And and we've seen him do this, go down the route of fighting terrorism and these things, which as we know are just ways to finesse and skew a situation. But yeah, I'd like to know how someone can make the decisions that have been made and justify them essentially.
I would pay to see that interview. I hope someday it
Uh,
comes to
you can
fruition.
be the moderator.
I'd love that. I'll hold you to that if it comes
Yeah,
to it.
yeah.
I want to pivot now after what was a solid hour of just incredible information about Syria to another country that viewers of the channel love learning about, and that is North Korea. And again, another dictatorship, another country that Americans virtually never stepped foot in, certainly since Otto Warmbier was tragically killed there. How did you find yourself in North Korea? And I know you have a hockey. Again, there's some pictures in the book. North Korean hockey national team. Can you? I mean, I have so many questions about this too. How'd you end up in North Korea? Is it true you got to go through China, right? You get into North Korea through China, right?
Yeah, exactly. And one of the I'm glad that this interview is being structured the way it is because it's so like I'm 36 years old. I've been alive for like 13,000 days and I find myself talking so much about 63 of them, right? That happened in Syria, which were significant and there's a lot of messages and lessons that I think can be helpful to others in a range of ways. But there were some other things that happened too, and this is one of the trips that I do get asked about quite a bit, and overall had this fantastic experience again in a place that is negatively perceived or that oftentimes people or media says we're not supposed to like this place or go there. But I was from 2012 to 2018, I lived and worked in Singapore. I was working for a tech company, and in 2016, there was a Canadian man who was putting together a trip that was focused around hockey to North Korea to coach and play alongside their national team to help develop their program there. And I was very interested in this. Again, travel for me was always about learning it, and also it became a really great experience to use hockey as a way to build a cultural bridge, to use a sport to build those relationships. And so in March of 2016, I was invited to go there and coach their team. And I spent a week coaching and playing alongside the national team. When we were not at the rink, we were treated incredibly well. Everything was the hospitality was top notch. I'm not oblivious to the fact that I saw what they wanted me to see, and getting off that tourist track, things can look pretty grim and be very different. But my experience was so positive. Maybe you've had Korean food, it's delicious. Again, as I was mentioning with the Syria story, the overwhelming majority of people are just well-intentioned. They're good people, and that's what I experienced here too. And yes, it did go through China. We went to Beijing and then flew on Air Koryo, which is kind of its own adventure. They fly these very old planes from there to Pyongyang. And I remember arriving and kind of putting my U.S. passport through the window of the immigration officer in Pyongyang, and he looked at it and I mean we had been pre-approved and everything, but looked at it and waved me through, and it was great. A couple quick stories that I can tell from North Korea that might be interesting, but that was kind of generally how it came together.
Well, and I want to hear those stories for sure. Before I do though, because I grew up playing hockey.
Yeah.
I wasn't particularly good at hockey, but I enjoyed the sport growing up. Can you compare the talent of the North Korean national team? If you had to compare them, like, would they be like a really good high school team from Minnesota? I like, where would they stack up?
Yep, I would say they were more skilled than I expected. They skated well. They moved the puck well. They communicated amongst themselves well. I would say that they were like a U18 AAA team, roughly, which was a higher level of play than I was expecting, and actually really kind of exciting to see that the game had developed to that point in a place that's has this isolationist stance towards the rest of the world and is disconnected.
So let's get into some stories about North Korea. And before we dive into the first one, I did like, so you said you were treated very well and the hospitality is great. do you have like government minders with you at all times? I'm guessing they just didn't let you roam around wherever you wanted to, right?
Yeah, we were always with our guides. We had a male and a female guide, and both of them were named Kim, but they did a great job with our agenda and always were with us. One of the noteworthy things about this trip is that it was facilitated by a Canadian man named Michael Spaver, who um, organized this entire trip. I met him in North Korea. He facilitated this fantastic experience for us. And then we left. And in December of 2018, Michael was wrongfully detained and taken hostage in China. And he was held for 2 years and 10 months in and this was in response to Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive who was detained in Vancouver. Then the Chinese responded and detained both Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spaver, who was a friend of mine. And then my situation in Syria happened within these 2 years and 10 months. And then in September of, I guess it was 2021, I think I had to get the dates, but Michael was released from China, and I will never forget. A couple months after he was released, I went up to Calgary and met up with him, and we sat and we had breakfast together. And I remember kind of reflecting on the trajectory of our friendship. We had met in North Korea. We had both then been wrongfully detained by hostile foreign governments. Both were released, and then we were both having breakfast together in Canada, in Calgary. And so we find ourselves kind of supporting each other through our own reintegration processes. But Michael had set up this fantastic experience for us in Pyongyang to coach their national hockey team. So that was one of the elements of this trip that became noteworthy, and so grateful that his situation ended peacefully too. The just one other thing that I'll mention: when we were there, we went and visited the DMZ from the north, which actually about 6 weeks earlier, I had been in Seoul and visited on a tour from the south, and got to about, I would say, within about 50 feet of where I had been the like just a few weeks before. And the North Korean guide spent most of the tour talking about how the American imperialists are responsible for a divided Korean peninsula and all this stuff. Then we get into the gift shop at the end of the tour, and I'm like, oh, maybe I'll buy this. Like, how can I pay for it? And they said, US dollars.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, you just spent 2 hours like shitting on us, and now you want US dollars? What's some of that? So there are these kind of quirky moments that happen, but overall, again, just had a great experience there.
Did they keep you? So I love North Korea documentaries, which is why I thought it was so cool that we could talk about two places I'm fascinated by, Syria and North Korea. Did you stay in the hotel where they keep all the foreigners? It's like the island hotel so that they can't run off in the middle of the night.
You know what? So there was something we were like supposed to stay there, but then and actually ended up staying at a different place pretty close by, but it was not the island hotel that you're talking about. But I know exactly what you're referencing.
And so, I'm literally just curious. What were your accommodations like? Were they like a hotel in the U.S.? Were there like restaurants and bars at the hotel and things like that?
It was a like a pretty standard hotel. It was comfortable. I had a roommate, a friend of mine who was with us, and it was kind of this old school kind of Soviet influenced vibe at the hotel, but overall pretty comfortable. I actually got a on the last day we were there, I went to the basement of the hotel and got a haircut, and that was like the only time that I was like kind of off the grid a little bit. And I went down there by myself and got a haircut. So like those kinds of things were available, and it was actually just like a pretty normal setting at that hotel.
That's mind-boggling to me. Was it like, do you remember how much you paid for it?
Um, Gosh, I think I paid for the whole trip like as a package, so I don't know for sure. But one day we went out. I have videos of this. We went out to Kim Il Sung Square, and I was doing like morning aerobics with thousands of other Koreans, with the pictures of the Kims in front of us, and so we were able to do that kind of stuff. And again, there's so many tragic, heartbreaking things happening in North Korea, and I was shielded from those. Actually, I remember when we were going down to the DMZ, it was unknown to the guides, but the highway down there was actually closed off. There was a section of it that was closed off, and so our bus had to get off the highway and go on some side roads around this blocked off road. And this was the only time in a week that we were there that the Kims, our two guides, told us, please don't take pictures. This was the only time because we were essentially seeing some things that we weren't supposed to see. And when we got off, we just went through some very underdeveloped areas, villages. I mean, a lot of it, frankly, looked like villages that I had seen in rural Africa and places like that. So again, getting off that track, things can look pretty grim, but the way we were treated was like royalty.
Which is exactly what they want. It's like the old.
Exactly. They
Did you
want
ever?
me to come and say to you, I had a great experience. This is
Right.
literally exactly what they want. And that's what happened.
Have you ever seen the old Vice documentaries when they went to North Korea? Shane Smith back in the day.
I think I've seen some of that.
Well,
Yeah.
it's identical to what you were saying, and they like took them to like this pool bar, like a billiards bar, and they're there, and there's just one employee. There's no other like Koreans there, and they got it stocked, and they realized like, oh, like this was only put on for us. Like this is not actually a real thing. This is just they want us to believe that this is what it's like.
So like there were times similarly, and yeah, it's similarly, we would be on our bus and we'd pull up to a stoplight and there would be like these kids would show up and they'd start kicking a soccer ball on the sidewalk. And we started wondering like, are they actually playing on the sidewalk or did they just show up because our bus is here? Uh, is this real? Is any of this real? Am I real? It's kind of this like Truman Show type setting.
Do you have any other stories from North Korea that really stick out in your mind as good ones?
One night, Mrs. Kim, our guide, pulled out her phone and showed us the what I think is characterized as like the Wikipedia of North Korea.
Oh, this is going to
And
be great.
and well, like I actually don't have like anything else because it was in Korean, and so it was kind of like through a translator. So I didn't really like get to get to like any specific like noteworthy anecdotes other than what I learned was that they have their own like version of this that that they have access to, and of course it would be kind of what I think is expected, just kind of their view on things and shielding their citizens from a lot of things that are happening.
Do you think people in North Korea understand how poor their country is relative to just their neighbors to the south or Japan? Or do you think that they are so isolated that they just kind of think that that is the way it is everywhere?
Mm. I don't know for sure, but I think it's a range. I think there are a good number of people there who do know and who are aware, and then I think there are people who don't too. So I think it's a range based on my experience, and that's kind of my best guess.
All right, so I got just two more countries for you that I want to discuss. Do you have
Yeah.
you got a little more time?
I have time, and I sometimes say name a country, I'll tell you a story.
Well, that's what earlier in the interview, you're talking about how you were in Iran for what was it, New Year's? You celebrated New Year's in Iran,
Yep.
and
Yep.
what year was that?
So that was 2016 into 2017, and I flew from Dubai. I went over to Kish Island, which is kind of like the Hawaii of Iran, for lack of a better terms, and this is also a little bit kind of touchy as well because there have been Americans who have had issues on Kish Island, specifically on that island, and so um, that's always something to keep in mind. But my experience there was was so positive. I went actually on this New Year's Eve cruise in the Persian Gulf and watched fireworks as we rang in 2017 and met some Persian families who I'm still in touch with today. They when we got back from the cruise, they invited me to their hotel room and had me for tea, and I'm still connected, as I mentioned today. And so again, had this really positive experience, beautiful beaches in the Gulf there. And again, I'm not trying to play down the authoritarian regime that's there and causing all kinds of trouble. I'm just speaking about my experience. And I think it's so I always tried to share the positivity of these negatively perceived or lesser known places, because that's truly what I experienced. Just so much positivity everywhere. And unfortunately, this positivity isn't what sells in our world. We want to hear about the shit that went wrong and the problems and the bad things that are happening. And that's frustrating for me because I literally went to every country in the world and experienced such little negativity. I mean, the only negativity that I experienced, I wrote a book about it.
Right.
And it's like I could write 100 books about the positivity, but nobody wants to hear about that. And it's so frustrating because that's really the summary of my experience is the positivity.
Well, and that's good to hear. And I'm a big believer that people often have more in common with each other than they have that separates them. And I think at the common level, the average person, I don't think the average person in Iran is a bad person at all, not even a little
Oh,
bit. I think the government of Iran has done some truly heinous things. And, but you have to be able to separate those two things.
exactly. I'll tell you some of the most significant things I learned through travel. One is never judge people by the actions of their government. As you just mentioned, I would say people who have the least often give the most. Something I found to be true in all corners of the world. And I also learned that every person's why is the same. We all eat, sleep, breathe, want to be happy, or chasing some kind of goal. It's only the how that changes.
That's very well said. So overall, you did like Iran. That's my mom's best friend she used to spend a ton of time in Iran before the revolution happened. So I've
Yeah, again, my experience was positive, and I don't have again, I don't have plans to go back at this point. I'm really not in that space, focused on that right now. But again, another very important place in the world, and just because our governments disagree doesn't mean we have to.
what about, let me throw you this country now. What was your experience in Russia?
So I've been to Russia just once. I was there for a week. I actually went with my parents. We went to Moscow for about 2 days, and then this was in 2014. We went to the Olympics in Sochi. And this was this was also kind of contentious because Putin had spent like some outrageous amount of money on the Olympics. It was like $50 billion, if I remember correctly. I think he built like the most expensive road in the world from the village up to the mountains where the skiing events were taking place. So that was a little, it's just always shades of gray with all of these things. But um, again, my experience was so positive. Like I played hockey my whole life. I literally went to the gold medal game and watched the best players in the world play. The facilities were incredible. Um, and so that was my experience in Russia, and that's gosh, now over 10 years ago. But that was when I was in Russia.
Was there any country that you visited that exceeded your expectations by so much? You're like, I can't believe how insane of a place this is. Maybe you had low and then it just blew you away.
Yeah. So interestingly, one of the places that comes to mind with that question is is actually Lebanon. And this is before this happened. I just think it has some of the best food in the world. It has some of the most beautiful women in the world. It's naturally gorgeous. It's the hospitality there is fantastic. And I think there's so much potential in Lebanon. And I wasn't really expecting all of these positive things. So Lebanon is a place that comes to mind. Another place I'll say is Taiwan for some of the same reasons. So, some of the best food. Taipei is such a fascinating city. Din Tai Fung, the dumplings, the food, the hiking down, particularly the East Coast, is gorgeous in Hawaii. And again, there's a lot of political um, challenges or friction in a range of ways, but um, really incredible people and a fantastic place to visit. Fantastic place to visit is Taiwan.
I've always wanted to visit Taiwan. I just hope to visit it before any major conflict might kick off in the next
Right,
decade.
for sure, for sure. Yeah,
And they're obviously very important to us because they make, what is it, like 96% of our chips or it's
like
some astronomical number.
yeah, I think it's like, yeah, 95, 96. I think you're right, of the most sophisticated semiconductors. Yeah.
One of my, it's interesting you mentioned Lebanon. One of my close friends spent a long time in Lebanon and he loves it too. And I think what Americans get wrong about Lebanon, and I've never been there to be clear, but it's like it's a unique situation where you have the Lebanese government, you have the Lebanese military, you have their political wills, and then you have Hezbollah, which is the most well-armed paramilitary organization in the world within the country that also has its own political leaders and its own military as well. It's
And
just
Hezbollah has representation in the Lebanese parliament and government. So
it's just crazy. It's like unbelievably complex. And I feel sometimes Americans try to boil everything down to just the simple common denominator. Doesn't really work that way in real life. But it's like Syria. You have 12 different factions controlling different areas, warring. It's crazy. Other than the stories we've talked about, I'll leave on a high note. From all your travels, you visited 193 countries. What's your single favorite story to tell about traveling?
um okay. Well, if you ask me this question tomorrow, I might give you a different answer. But something that comes to mind, uh again, it's the main message is just the positivity. But uh this was in a quick story. So this was in 2019, actually, not too just a couple months before Syria. I was in Samoa, the island nation in the South Pacific, and a friend of a friend, her name was Marissa. She came and picked me up at the airport and took me around. It's a beautiful island. And one of the evenings we were there, we went to dinner at this actually an Italian place, and we were having pizza. And Marissa's boyfriend came and joined us, and his name was Paul. And Paul, so there's three of us sitting at dinner, and Paul was one of the captains of the Samoan national rugby team, which, as you probably know, in that part of the world is like a big deal, right? So I didn't realize quite how big of a deal it was until we went to pay our bill, and the currency in Samoa is called the tala. So Marissa pulls out 10 tala to pay the waitress. And before she pays, she shows me the 10 tala bill. And it turns out that Paul, along with the two other captains of the rugby team, are on the note.
That's
They're literally
incredible.
on the money. And so I looked at him, and this guy I was sitting with, I'm like, you're on the money of this country? And so that was like this ultimate mic drop situation. It's like people who I think about who are on money. I'm thinking George Washington or
Right.
Nelson Mandela or the Queen, right? And also Paul, the rugby player that I was sitting at with dinner. So these quirky things happen in these off the beaten path places that are just totally unexpected.
I love it. Well, Sam, I've got to thank you so much. This was such a unique, fun change of pace from our usual guest lineup. And here's the book. It's Saving Sam. Go out and get it. His story is absolutely incredible. And Sam, could you tell people where they can follow you if they're interested in learning more?
Sure. So I'm on all the normal social media platforms. Feel free to reach out. I should be pretty easy to find. And I would love to hear from you. Please don't hesitate to reach out at any point. I'd love to be connected.